Shadowrun is a really rules-dense game, so much so that the 5th edition core rulebook gives little more than an overview of the setting. After all, in order to cover just the basics of it, I had to break my video reviews of it up into several different parts, based on the subject. And there's still a lot of details I realized that in post I was overlooking, as it became apparent when you guys started asking me things in the comments. And that's just the core book. Today though, we're going to take a look at Run Faster, a splat book for Shadowrun 5th edition that's, all around, a nice book to have. The long and short is that no matter what you're interested in when it comes to splat books, there's something in Run Faster for you. It has new mechanics, new ways of playing the game, all kinds of setting and lore, what you should expect out of Shadowrun, and also some ease of life improvements. And to top it all off, the book itself has a bit of personality too. It's arranged and written as if people were writing about it on The Matrix. Get comfortable, chummers, and we'll go ahead and take it chapter by chapter with what you can expect when you crack open this book, so you'll be able to decide for yourself whether you should get it or not. And if you don't want to wait some 26 minutes, I'll sum it all up like this. If you like Shadowrun, you want this book. And if you're a GM for Shadowrun, you definitely want this book. The first chapter of Run Faster is who you are and how you got here. It's mostly setting information, about how people become Shadowrunners. I'll admit, I didn't find this one too compelling of a read. But if you're the sort who really likes thinking about who your character is and what they did before becoming a mercenary operative, especially of the criminal variety, this might be an interesting chapter to read. Ethics, codes, and other jokes is the next chapter, and it talks about the Code of Honor negative quality. And it includes some specific examples of codes of honor. These range from an idealized version of Bushido to wanting to live in harmony with spirits, or my personal favorite, the Code of the White Hat, based on the idea that information should be free. However, as with all discussions of morals and ethics, nobody can ever agree on what anything means. There's a counterpoint to every point, and this chapter addresses that too. There's a few corporate codes of honor as well, some of which share the name of a Shadowrunner version, including Code of the White Hat. The corporate version of White Hat is instead based on the idea that deckers with corporations are securing the Matrix for the good of law-abiding users. And if a particular file needs to be deleted for the good of the Matrix, no matter what it is, it's going in the trash. Especially if the corporate overlords say that it's dangerous. What I like most about this chapter, though, is that it includes a very powerful quote from Hero Systems' Steve Long. A disadvantage that isn't a disadvantage isn't worth any points. Meaning, if your character has the Code of Honor quality, it doesn't mean much if it doesn't have any impact on how they behave. If they're opposed to deleting files on the Matrix, don't try to circumvent this by having them make somebody else do it, or worse, not even being a hacker at all. The spice of runners' lives is somewhat short, but it has a lot of great details that shows Shadowrun is more than just Corp A wants you to somehow sabotage Corp B. It tells you about 3 different ways to switch up objectives for the players in this game. Changing who's giving them the job, changing what the job is, or even where the job takes place. Some things to note about this chapter are as follows. A lot of passages make reference to things covered in the book's Street Grimoire, so if you haven't read that, you're gonna get in a little over your head with this one. It also references head cases, victims of cognitive fragmentation disorder, detailed in the book Stolen Souls, and it's also a recurring theme in this book. The short version of CFD is that nanites infect somebody's brain and rewrite their personality to be a meat puppet for an artificial intelligence. A plot point suggested for how to really make a run more interesting. Even without familiarity of Street Grimoire and Stolen Souls though, there's plenty else to work with in here. For instance, it mentions that not all work is done in the city, with magic returning to the world and making all sorts of ordinary creatures suddenly more dangerous. Some arcane societies and mage cavils might want some protection when they go out into the wilderness to find magical reagents or ley lines, or even a mean beast might have organs that are used as reagents. And while we're on the subject of magic, one of the elements mentioned from Street Grimoire is Fulveus, and I might be mispronouncing that. Basically, they're places where magic simply doesn't work. Magic societies are just one possible non-corporate employer, though. The players could just as easily get work from local mom-and-pop shops, crime syndicates, or even secret societies. This chapter gives specific details on how all these different employers would behave, such as how mom-and-pop shops are more likely to barter, crime syndicates will take things personally, and secret societies are just straight up bonkers. This is definitely one of the chapters you should read if you're a game master of Shadowrun. More Than Skin Deep is a lore chapter about the different metatypes, complete with about how much each of them make up the population. It explains the wider culture of a given metatype, as well as a few societies around the world composed of them. It wouldn't be much of a cyberpunk setting if it didn't also go into the subject of counterculture, alternative ways that these people organize themselves. It also primes the reader for something else that comes up in later chapters: changelings and shapeshifters. This chapter is a good read that paints a fascinating picture about how the different metatypes fit into society as a whole, or how they don't. Before we move on, I want to read for you a passage about my favorite metatype in Shadowrun. How trolls fit into society. They don't. It is that simple. Society may tolerate them, and you'll see some working as janitors, dock workers, or security goons, but for the most part, trolls exist on the edge or even completely outside of the world's societies. A few exceptional individuals have made it up the social ladder, but that is definitely the exception rather than the rule. Fitting in anywhere is a daily struggle that constantly reminds trolls of their outsider status. Construction Kits is a mechanical chapter that offers all kinds of new methods for character creation. The first among these, and most interesting, is the sum to 10 method. And as some of you have mentioned in the comments before, this is very similar to the priority method used in the core book. Each priority rating has a point value from 0 to 4, and you're not allowed to go over 10 points. Meaning, if you're perfectly okay with a few aspects of your character being at priority E, you can bump other aspects up a little bit more. Meaning you can have 2 A ratings if you're willing to pick up some D's and an E to compensate. It grants you a lot more flexibility, while still giving you a familiar structure for building a character. And if you're a fan of the priority method, you can still use sum to 10, since if you look at all the letters and their values, one of each adds up to 10. Though if you want even more freedom in making characters, this chapter also goes into detail about making a character with a tally of 800 karma. And there's another kind of step back from the karma method that adds a different kind of structure you won't find in priority or sum to 10, the life modules method. This one grants you a few skills and attributes as you go along and make choices about your character's life growing up, with each of those packages costing so many points along the way. Unlike life paths, the similarly named mechanic from our Talzorian games like Cyberpunk 2020 and Mekton, these are not necessarily randomly chosen. This method might be better for people who prefer to develop stories for their characters while they make them, with stats being more of an afterthought. Mess of Metahumanity is equal parts setting and new mechanics. It introduces all kinds of variants of the different metatypes, just in case you wanted to be something a little unusual. Many of the different meta variants are more common in certain regions than others, such as the Oni variant of Orc being common in Japan, or the Cyclops variant of Troll to the Mediterranean. I'm not usually a fan of variant races like this in games, since it usually opens up the doors for players to pick something wild and out of the ordinary, under the mistaken idea that a more unique race makes them a better role player. But otherwise, if being unique for the sake of being unique is your thing, then by all means go nuts with this chapter. In fact, there's other things to spring for if unique is your thing. The Metasapiens give you really unusual things to play with. Centaurs, Naga, Pixies, Sasquatches, take your pick. That's not all though. You could also be a shapeshifter, an animal that's capable of taking a metahuman form. So you could be a beagle that's able to turn into a gigantic cyclops. There's even spaces in between for anything else you can dream up with the changelings, which might otherwise be called mutants in any other setting. Let me slow down just a second though. Changelings actually have fairly interesting lore elements to them. They tend to show up wherever there's a surge in mana in a given location, with one of the examples that the book gives being passes from Halley's Comet. And mutants is really kind of a good explanation for them. They're people that, for whatever reason, exhibit unusual and difficult to classify traits. With all these new options, there's also a new list of mutagenic abilities, special powers that are typically only available at character creation for making your changeling into whatever your twisted little heart desires. Though, speaking of twisted little hearts, let's talk a little bit more about the next chapter, Into the Night. If playing as a genetic deviation, mutant, or shapeshifting animal weren't enough, you also get more options with this chapter. Options that have very drastic drawbacks. Nobody said being a creature of the night was easy after all. This chapter is all about playing as vampires and ghouls, otherworldly blood drinkers and flesh eaters. True to folklore, in Shadowrun, these creatures were once ordinary people before they turned into monsters, usually after an encounter with another such monster that involved teeth-breaking skin. The Shadowrun twist on it, though, is that the causes of this condition are actually well documented and known. The cause being the human metahuman vampire virus. Both conditions, vampire and ghoul, are caused by two different strains of this one virus. The disease turns characters into more than just blood-sucking and flesh-eating monsters, though. They allow them to consume the very soul of their victims, in addition to infecting them as well. For this and many other reasons, there's an open bounty on vampires and ghouls, which makes a team of supernatural monster hunters thematically viable in Shadowrun. On the flip side, that makes playing as one of these creatures all the more dangerous, as if the allergy to sunlight wasn't enough. There's also numerous subtypes of vampire and ghoul available, many of which are only available to certain metatypes. Creating a vampire or ghoul character isn't too much more difficult, since this condition is covered by qualities. Meaning all you really need to do is spend the requisite amount of karma at character creation, and boom, you're one of the HMVV infected. There's also options of turning during the course of play, which still comes with the required karma cost. If you don't have the required karma to pay for it all at once, it's treated as something you'll have to pay off with any karma you earn through the course of play. As You Can Be is a section all about other positive and negative qualities, because Run Faster is a book that's all about options and other ways of doing things. There's not much to say about it. It's a list of yet more things to customize your character with. Some of my favorite selections from this chapter are the Adrenaline Surge positive quality, which lets a character always act first, regardless of their initiative roll, as well as Tough as Nails, which grants one more stun or physical track box. I'm also fond of the negative quality, Did You Just Call Me Dumb? Which indicates your character is uncontrollably snide, making all their social glitches even worse than they normally would be. Also of note, this chapter gives you yet more sample characters, some of which use the new qualities available. The chapter Who You Know takes a closer look at contacts, the sort of things they can do for a Shadowrunner and how they might want Shadowrunners to repay them. This is a great chapter to read if you're unsure how to use charisma-based face characters, one of the subjects those of you in the comments asked for help with. While contacts aren't all that a face uses in Shadowrun, they're definitely one of the more prominent resources they have, since you get 3 times your charisma score and karma to spend on contacts. While all the basics of how contacts work is laid out in the core rulebook, there is a quick refresher in this chapter. To sum it up quickly here too, contacts can do the following things. Legwork, which is finding things out for you. Networking, which is introducing you to new people. Handle swag, buying and selling things for you. Shadow services, which are skills that you'd expect another runner to have. Personal favors, which is pulling strings like making security look the other way for a brief window, or whispering words into a powerful person's ear. Or support, which is the other cool stuff like a place to crash, neat things you can borrow from them, or anything else you would expect a normal friend to do. It's important to note this list is a bit longer than what's stated in the core book, since shadow services, personal favors, and support are all variations of the favor ability listed in the core rulebook. Once you pass that, the chapter goes into what contacts might want in return, and gives a little bit more food for thought besides cold hard cash. Sometimes it's quid pro quo. They'll help you with something if you help them with something. Other times they may not want money, since most cash transactions in Shadowrun are electronic, and thus traceable in some way. In that case, there may be some unusual item they got their eyes on, like some kind of media from the Fifth World, or one of my favorite examples, they want genuine coffee, as opposed to soy calf. And if you're a GM that happens to have a player that's going to make a lot of use of contacts, there's plenty of useful things for you too. There's a generator for coming up with some personality and other traits of contacts, as well as some quick write-ups for different kinds of contacts. This list is much more extensive than the ones presented in the core rulebook, and most of the write-ups here include other ways that a given stat block can be used, such as the Recyclador. They're described as a troll that collects all manner of old media and technology, and in addition to finding anything from the Fifth World, they could probably also hide bodies for you. This could also be repurposed as a junkyard or sewage technician, or any other person you might find rummaging around in the garbage. Who You Know is a deceptively useful chapter that very nicely sets up the stage for what you can do with contacts. Speaking of chapters that set the stage, Bosses and Betrayers is one that sets up the right amount of paranoia and disgust you need to really play Shadowrun just right. This is a chapter all about that bastard Mr. Johnson. The corporate suit you really can't trust, but also can't get a good payday without. This chapter is entirely a setting and lore chapter, but it's a really effective one. It hits all the right notes that would make anybody with half an ounce of decency in their body seethe in rage. It's a case of art imitating life. You don't have to look hard to find headlines of rumors of shifty things that corporations are doing and getting away with. And the sort of person that not only justifies but glorifies this sort of behavior is Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson knows there's more Shadowrunners out there than jobs for them to do. Mr. Johnson has no problem turning down a Shadowrunner if he doesn't like the color of their jacket or any other detail unrelated to their ability to do the job. Mr. Johnson doesn't want to share any critical details of the job with you, regardless of, and especially if, he knows them. Mr. Johnson actually hopes you die on the job, because then he won't have to pay you. Mr. Johnson never planned on paying you in the first place, actually, and is hoping you'll give him what he wants before you accept payment. Mr. Johnson also plans on killing you after he pays you, so he can get his money back. Mr. Johnson is a bastard, and you can't do anything about it. If you go around fragging any Mr. Johnsons you see on the basic principle of them being, well, Mr. Johnson, the other Mr. Johnsons are gonna talk, and they're gonna learn not to do business with you. That said though, there are a few situations where it actually is okay, if not expected, for Shadowrunners to kill Mr. Johnson. If Mr. Johnson screws a Shadowrunner out of money, it's perfectly acceptable for that Shadowrunner to hunt them down and make Mr. Johnson pay up, either in money or blood. The caveat, though, is that the Shadowrunners only get one of those. If Mr. Johnson pays the Shadowrunner after screwing them over, Mr. Johnson gets to live. Nguyen is traceable. Other Mr. Johnsons will be able to connect the dots between the death of one of their own and some of Mr. Johnson's money going to Shadowrunners. Even if you manage to get him to start talking money, Mr. Johnson is a gutless worm. He's still going to find a way to avoid paying you, and he's hoping you want him to live long enough for that moment to come. Because if he dies first, there's no way you're getting paid. And if these rules all seem stupid and arbitrary, remember what I said at the start of this segment. This is a case of art imitating life. This same sort of dreck happens in the real world. And just like in the real world, there are a few other ways to make money, and a few other people who might be willing to pay you for your talents. But remember the theme of Shadowrun. Everything has a price. The mom and pop paying you to take care of something may have no intention of screwing you, but that doesn't mean they're gonna pay as well. And just because they have no intention of deceiving you, doesn't mean that what they'll be telling you is accurate. They might think their daughter is a good girl, but they don't know who she's been hanging out with. It could be some gangbangers, or maybe it's the local church youth group like they say. But what they don't realize is that the youth group was organized as an easy way for some vampires to feed. The Mafia may pay as well as Mr. Johnson, but they take things personally. Too personally. If a job goes wrong with a Mr. Johnson, like the person you're extracting turns out to be a vampire, he won't take it personally if you put the bloodsucker out of their misery. You won't get paid, but Mr. Johnson will at least let you take the bounty for that vampire. A mob boss won't be so forgiving if his daughter you were supposed to rescue turns out to be a feral vampire. And when she dies as you're defending yourself, you can expect to have to deal with his goons repaying the favor to you. I said it before, and I'll say it again. Bosses and Betrayers is a great chapter to read if you want to get the feel for the right mindset you need to be in for Shadowrun. A dump of one's own goes over lifestyle. How your character lives when they're not out breaking the law for fun and profit. It has some expanded rules for what comes with a lifestyle. Rules that allow for more customization of what your character gets when they shell out new yen every month. I won't go into explicit detail, but this is probably an interesting chapter to look into if you're playing Shadowrun in such a way that focuses more on the day-to-day aspects of life in the shadows, and less on the occasional job that makes the day-to-day possible. I'd instead like to bring your attention to the final chapter of Run Faster, Pack Your Kit. This is a chapter about one of my favorite parts about RPGs, but least favorite parts of Shadowrun, equipment. One of the reasons I brought attention to Chummer 5A in my initial series of Shadowrun videos was because it makes inventory management for character creation so much easier. However, beyond a checklist of items you should have, you're not given much guidance on what to buy, how much ammo, what kind of equipment, and what special options, so on and so forth. It's a bit hard to really pin down what's too little or too excessive. This is where Pack Your Kit comes in. It's primarily a list of all manner of items a Shadowrunner might need, in quantities and with qualities that would be useful. It doesn't include any write-ups of what does what, you'll still need to refer to the core book for all that, but it makes shopping for starting gear a little bit easier. And if you're making characters using one of the karma methods, it includes how much karma you'll be spending for a given pack at character creation as well, so it removes some of the mathematics for you. This is a quality of life chapter. If Chummer 5A was something for keeping track of your equipment, Pack Your Kit is a guide for what you should be keeping track of. And that's everything that's in Run Faster. It's an all-around helpful book for anybody and everybody. There's plenty of lore for people who have more questions about how things fit together in the Sixth World. There's no shortage of extra gameplay goodies, from different metatypes, new qualities, some quality of life additions, and even new methods of character creation. And of course, there's also all kinds of new ideas for different things you can do with Shadowrun. Simply put, Run Faster is a book you can't go wrong with, regardless of what you're looking for. I highly recommend it for anybody who's into Shadowrun. Thanks for watching. If you thought this review was helpful, click the thumbs up button to give me a like. And if you're interested in more about Shadowrun, or just other RPGs in general, feel free to subscribe or check out my other videos. So with all that said, I am Arunter Shadel. Watch your back, shoot straight, conserve ammo, and never, ever cut a deal with a dragon.